Now we're going to review the production possibility frontier and try to identify how many different topics we can use it for in preparation for the exam. So the production possibility frontier, known shortly or abbreviated to PPF, is a diagram with two axes. So let's identify the two choices that we're going to make for this economy. We're going to start with an economy which is only producing two goods, hairdryers and kettles. Now, as you might surmise from the characteristics of these goods, the materials that you use, whether it's your manufacturing equipment, your physical space, your manufacturing employees, are really similar. So if we wanted to move from one industry to another, we could do this very effectively. So essentially, the frontier on this diagram is going to be a straight line. So let's imagine we can have 5 units of hairdryers, or we can have 5 units of kettles. Obviously, 5 units represents something like a million individual items. So you can see you've got a trade-off which gives us an additional unit of kettles for each unit of hairdryers that we sacrifice. So essentially, this is our production possibility frontier, and the slope is equal to the rate of transformation. So what do we have to give up in terms of hairdryers in order to get more units of kettles? It's going to be very unusual to have a straight line in this way, because most components, most inputs cannot be so easily moved from a first industry, hairdryers, into the second industry, kettles. So let's consider some more realistic industries. So now we've moved to a slightly more realistic kind of economy, which is producing kettles or it's producing cheese. So you can see that there are different types of inputs and different types of employee skills and managerial skills associated with each of the industries. So rather than being able to sacrifice easily a unit of the inputs for cheese and transform them into kettles, we can't do that. It's not so simple to move our inputs from one industry to the other. And therefore our production possibility frontier has a curved slope. It has a concave shape to the origin. So essentially this tells us it's not easy to move the inputs, but it also gives us information about specialisation. And the curve of the production possibility frontier tells us it's better to use the inputs which are available in this country to make a combination of items. Now let's look at a past test question. It asks us to consider and illustrate, which again means using a diagram, a trade-off for a firm which is deciding how to use its inputs, its resources, to construct two different items. A consumer good, which we're going to say remains to be kettles, and a different type of good, a capital good, which we'll say is machinery. As with most trade-offs, we're going to give it a concave production possibility frontier. So if we give up units, increasing units of machinery to make kettles, we get a decreasing return. So this is to do with diminishing returns to investment. So essentially, if we were asked to represent a trade-off for a country or a company in terms of the two different types of items it could make, machinery, the capital intensive good, and kettles, the consumer good, then we'd expect to see this concave production possibility frontier. Another past question focuses on representing the scenario open to a manufacturer whom we've called Diego, who has a trade-off between making two types of wooden furniture. So the types of wooden furniture that are available to Diego in this example are he can make tables or he can make chairs. So in this question we were asked to label all of the identified points on the question paper and reproduce it in our answer book. So thinking about tables and chairs, point A, which is tangential to the vertical axis, is when Diego only makes tables. Similarly, point B, tangential to the horizontal axis, is where Diego specialises in chairs. Using all of the resources, because remember it's efficient to be at any point on your production possibility frontier, he can make a combination represented by E, which looks like a roughly even split between tables and chairs, or he can make at point F more chairs than tables. And if you think about this intuitively, you don't have a one-for-one trade-off of chairs and tables. You normally have a table with multiple chairs. So this intuitively looks like a good use of resources and is likely to meet consumer demand, although both points are efficient. Now obviously, when we see a diagram like this, we're going to expect to have a point which is inside the production possibility frontier, point C, which represents a scenario in which Diego is not using all of his resources. It could be that there's a low level of demand, or it could be that there is inefficiency in the organisation. But this illustrates that resources are spare. There is spare capacity. And then we have point D, which is outside the production possibility frontier, which means something needs to change within the organisation in order to reach this point. So it might be that Diego needs more inputs in terms of quantity, or it might mean that he needs to change something about the way he organises his business. So it might be to do with the quality of process or the quality of management, or he might need to invest in new technology. So currently this point outside the production possibility frontier is not reachable unless something changes. We can use the production possibility frontier to talk about macroeconomic circumstances as well. So let's consider a scenario where we have a capital-intensive industry and a labour-intensive industry. So again, our scenario would probably result in a production possibility frontier like this. So if we put all of our resources into the labour-intensive industry, this is the maximum level of output. If we put all of our resources into a capital-intensive industry, we could be at this point here. Any point on the production possibility frontier represents an efficient use of resources within this country. Any point here represents spare capacity or inefficient use, and any point here is something which we cannot yet achieve, so it means we need greater resources in terms of quantity or in terms of quality. To think about this in less abstract terms, let's think about an economy which has chemicals and hairdressing as its two industries. So we're hypothesising that this is the UK. All the resources can go into chemicals, or they can go into hairdressing. If we have a scenario here, so going back to the example we had previously, we have E and F, efficient use of all the resources in this economy. And then we have this position here, C. So if we think about this in terms of the performance of an individual firm, whether it's Diego's or any other firm, then position C represents spare capacity or inefficient use of resources. In a macroeconomic context, C implies unemployment. So if we wanted to use this diagram to talk about supply and demand side policies, then we could say that C represents an equilibrium in an economy with unemployment. And in order to reach the production possibility frontier again, in order to use up all of the resources which are available, whether it's equipment, land, capital or labour, we need demand side policies. So if we think about the type of demand side policies that might be needed to move us from C to the production possibility frontier, then we have to go back to our original identification, which is that aggregate demand is to do with household consumption, firm investment, government spending and trade. So we could identify a range of different solutions to unemployment in this diagram. And let's imagine, for example, that the government decided to go with tax cuts for households. So they might go with a sales tax cut. So by increasing the disposable income to households, household consumption, we're likely to see an economy move from a position of unemployment up to full employment, represented by any point on the production possibility frontier. Remember, in our earlier micro example, we had point D, beyond the production possibility frontier. Something fundamental needed to change in this economy. Let's say we need to have greater quality of education and training in the labour force. So to reach this point, to go beyond the production possibility frontier, we're talking about supply side policies. So increasing the supply of resources to the economy, whether it's quantity or quality. When we had our lecture in trade, I tried to convince you of the theoretical benefits associated with trade, and we go back to the original work of theorists like Ricardo, who talked about comparative advantage and the benefits of specialisation which we associate with Adam Smith. So our example in the lecture was Moldova. Moldova had a particular advantage in the production of agricultural goods. So here we're showing that by specialising in wine, they can produce a very high level of output. Moldova is less able to produce power, whether it's electric or gas, and so we represent a lower total amount, respectively, of power if it specialises in producing just this good. So again, points 1 and 2 are on the production possibility frontier, representing efficient use of all the resources available in Moldova. But remember, we're trying to argue that by specialising in the good in which it has the comparative advantage, Moldova can achieve a higher level of consumption and satisfaction for its citizens. So remember, being on the production possibility frontier represents efficient use, and we think that this translates into the highest level of consumption and satisfaction for the citizens. So if Moldova decides to generate this amount of wine, in which it has comparative advantage, it could sell this amount to one of its trading partners. So export this amount of wine here to a trading partner, for example, Romania is one of its main trading partners, in order to swap it for electric power, which Romania has an advantage in producing. So by selling wine and exchanging it with Romania for power, we can now move beyond the production possibility frontier to this point here, so that citizens of Moldova have a higher level of satisfaction. And that concludes our revision on the production possibility frontier.